Let me ask you something. How safe do you feel in your own home? And how sure are you that you'd notice if something was off? Something as simple as a door opening, a footstep in the hallway, or a presence that didn't belong. Do you think that you'd recognize that danger in time? Or would it move quietly around you while you slept soundly at night? On November the 13th, 2022, those questions stopped being hypothetical when 4 university students were murdered inside their own home in Moscow, Idaho. At the time, they were living just off campus in a place that was meant for rest, studying, and safety. And what followed forced a community and then an entire nation to face one of the most horrifying and notorious cases of 2022. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're heading to Moscow, Idaho to look at a case that eventually became known as the Idaho 4. And I'll be honest with you here, the more that you dig at this case, the more that it seems to unravel. In fact, there are many details that I didn't even know about until I started researching this one. By the way, here is a quick reminder that I and the rest of my team at Coffeehouse Crime are all in fact humans, and we don't present with AI. We do have a cat though named Nero, so subscribe for Nero. Or, of course, to support your favorite YouTubers. We really do appreciate it. Thank you. Now then, with that said, let's get down to the usual. Please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of the Idaho 4. Welcome to Moscow, Idaho, folks. With a population of just over 25,000 residents, Moscow is inseparable from the University of Idaho. When I say that, what I mean is that the university isn't simply in the town, but it is quite literally Moscow's pulse. As for its students, Moscow feels safe. Violent crime is rare enough to feel abstract, and when something bad happens, it tends to be elsewhere to other people. Houses near campus blur into social spaces. Friends come and go, and doors are routinely left unlocked. It's the kind of place where noise complaints are the most likely police visit, and where life feels like one long social event day in and day out. Now, on King Road, which is a short walk away from campus and found on the southwest corner of town, was a 3-story rental house that stood like many others. As you may have already guessed, this was just another usual run-of-the-mill student house, cheap and cheerful, and filled with 6 young adults. The location was great actually. You had the university to the north and a few restaurants found only a few minutes further. However, it was just before noon on November the 13th, 2022 that this house, found on the skirts of Moscow, became the epicenter of one of the most violent and brutal stories that America had seen in years.
911 location of your emergency.
Something is happening. Something happened in our house. We don't know what.
Tell me exactly what's going on.
One of the roommates has passed out, and she was drunk last night, and she's not waking up.
Okay.
Oh, and they saw some man in their house last night. Can I just tell you what happened? Pretty much.
What is going on currently? Is someone passed out right now?
I don't really know, but pretty much at 4 a.m.
Okay, I need to know what's going on right now if someone is passed out. Can you find that out?
Yeah, I'll come. Come on, but we gotta go check. She's passed out. What's wrong? She's not waking up.
Okay.
Hello?
Is she breathing?
No.
Okay. I've already sent the ambulance and law enforcement. Stay on the line.
There's a police here right now.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna let you go since he's there with you and can help you.
Okay, thank you.
Shortly after this terrifying phone call was made, police arrived at the residence. From the street, nothing looked wrong or out of place. There was no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry, and the curtains were drawn. As they approached the property, some of them even expected that they would only be helping someone wake up. But once they were inside, the reality and gravity of it all quickly set in. What officers encountered was nothing short of horrific. And that's because this wasn't a single or small medical emergency, but was an all-out catastrophe. Additional units were called in immediately, and the home suddenly changed from a student house into a full-blown crime scene. The home was unnaturally still as police officers moved through its narrow hallways, pausing at corners and closed doors, and announcing themselves into rooms that never answered back. The first grim discovery came on the second floor when 2 students were found inside one of the bedrooms, and as officers continued in their investigation, they found 2 more victims in another bedroom. It was at that moment that they realized that 4 young students had all had their lives ended in the same house, across multiple bedrooms and on a single night. And so obviously, they realized that whatever was going on, this extended far past them, or the officers, or even Moscow. Meanwhile, outside, the neighborhood's tone shifted. It is the kind of tension that everyone dreads, because as police presence grew and the patrol cars arrived and then remained at the property, everyone waiting outside knew that this was not going to be just another noise complaint. It was in that moment that one of the officers stepped away from the property to speak with one of its surviving roommates. And from this footage, you can tell how horrified and shaken Dylan was.
All I heard was I heard her go upstairs, like, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep now because she's going upstairs.
You heard who go upstairs?
Kaylee and the dog Murphy.
And upstairs to the very top?
Yeah, that's where her room is.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden I heard her walking up, I heard her scream, and she ran downstairs because she saw someone. That's what I'm pretty sure she said. Someone's here, and she screamed and just ran downstairs. And I called for her name, but I jumped up and locked my door because I was so scared. And then I heard someone in the bathroom, and I heard her crying, and I heard some guy say that you're going to be okay, I'm going to help you. And I kept calling her name, but she wasn't answering. And then I opened the door for a second, and I saw this guy, and he was not insanely tall, but he was wearing all black and like this mask that was just covering his forehead and his mouth. And I locked the door, and I called, and I didn't know what to do.
This was at 4
a.m., yes.
Okay.
Now, Dylan claimed that she'd woken up in the middle of the night to sounds that she couldn't quite explain. Movement and voices that all felt a little off. It is worth noting, however, that despite the strangeness, she never felt threatened by any of it. Apparently, he was dressed all in dark clothing and didn't even acknowledge her presence. He just simply walked by towards the exit. It's the kind of encounter that you'd feel very uncomfortable in, especially as a woman. But with this being a student house, there could have been a million innocent explanations. And so she simply walked back inside her bedroom and shut her door. But the important part here is that her recollection of that evening changed everything about the story at that stage of the investigation. Because not only did it verify that an unknown, mysterious man was inside the property on the night that her 4 friends were murdered, but also that he had acted while everyone was fast asleep in bed. And as investigators took a closer look at the crime scene, they realized that, although clues were in fact sparse, there were a couple that they could indeed work with. But before we jump the gun here, who precisely were the Idaho 4? So, before answering that question, I'd first like to take you behind the scenes here at Coffeehouse Crime. With the turn of the new year, a lot of us are thinking about returning to work, getting back into the swing of things, and of course New Year's resolutions. But the truth is that a lot of us YouTubers don't actually stop over the festive period. And I'm going to let you in on a small secret here about YouTube. But by the time Christmas and the festive season has ended, many of us YouTubers actually see a huge dip to our AdSense earnings. Which makes sense, right? Because everyone's out of their usual routine over Christmas, and while they're seeing their family and friends, they're probably focusing on more cozy subjects. So with that in mind, I just want to say thank you to all of you who come here week in and week out to help support the channel. And with a natural dip over the festive period, this is precisely how our sponsors, like today's paid partner ZocDoc, can help keep the lights on over quieter moments. So, on the topic of resolutions, what have you decided for yourself this year? Is it perhaps pick up a new hobby, maybe go to the gym more regularly, or finally get around to looking after your health? Now, personally for me, I think this is probably the year that I finally get around to fixing my repetitive strain injury that I picked up at the gym. And ZocDoc will definitely help with that, and if health is on your list too, then I would love to tell you about them. For those of you who haven't heard of ZocDoc, it's a free website that helps you find and book high quality in-network doctors so you can find someone you love. With more than 150,000 providers across all 50 states, you can search and book providers across more than 200 specialties, including dermatology, dentistry, primary care, and eye care. view thousands of verified patient reviews to get a real sense of who your doctor is, and find one that you actually vibe with. You can also see their real-time availability, click to book instantly, and decide in person or video. Appointments made through ZocDoc typically happen within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score same-day appointments too. So, if you are serious about your health, then there is no better resolution than looking after it, and ZocDoc will help you find a doctor who listens, understands, and, of course, supports you. So, go to ZocDoc.com/coffeehousecrime to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video, and thank you to you folks for supporting the creators that you care about. And now, let's dive into who the Idaho 4 really were. As it always goes, they were all just ordinary people before this story became, well, a story. Much like you and I once were, they were all simply students, just caught in the ordinary gravity of college life. So, beginning with Madison Morgan, she was 21 years old at the time, and was a senior at the University of Idaho studying marketing. Friends described her as outgoing and loyal, and someone who kept people close and made plans easily. This is something we'll come back to towards the end of the video, but Madison worked at a local restaurant named the Mad Greek. Having grown up in Idaho, she was nearing the end of her college years, and so she was naturally looking ahead after graduation and whatever came next. Her close friend, Kaylee Gonsalves, was also 21 years old at the time. Also a senior who was studying general studies, she and Madison were described as inseparable. By now, they had known each other for several years, and would have likely been forever friends. Now, Kaylee was only weeks away from graduating, and had already accepted a job out of state. In fact, she had already even recently moved out of the King Road house, but had returned to see her friends. As for the weekend that she was tragically murdered, Kaylee was back in Moscow to spend time with Madison, and also to show her the new car that she had recently purchased. Now, on the second floor lived Sana Konodal, who was a 20-year-old junior that was studying marketing at the time. Alongside her was her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, who was also 20 at the time. Ethan was a freshman who was majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management, and was well known on campus for his warmth and friendliness. And although he didn't officially live at the King Road house, he spent much of his time here with his girlfriend, Sana. Interesting side note here, but both Sana and Madison worked at the same restaurant, and their connection was not accidental. This was a house that was shaped by overlapping friendships. Now, you could say that the house on King Road was rarely quiet. It wasn't overly drunk or dangerous or disorderly, but it definitely was social. Many of their friends would come by without any notice whatsoever. Music would play on the porch on most days, and with this many visitors, the noise was kind of inevitable. It is worth noting that in the months leading up to November, police had already been called to the address on more than one occasion. It wasn't for violence or anything criminal like that, and it was merely just noise complaints. But of course, with students being students, a lot of the other neighbors around would lose out on sleep. And as it turns out, one of those visits was even captured on police body cam footage.
Well, understand that you're responsible for the residents. Okay. So whoever else is here, if they have a safe way to get home, you need to kick them out. Okay. Or tell them to come inside and be quiet. Okay. Because the houses that are on this hill all the way around here, we can hear you from clear down the road when we were coming up here. We can hear the music. Okay. And that's, I'm so sorry. We're past the point of having polite conversations, okay? Because neighbors are being kept up.
As you can see in this video, officers approached the house late at night. The atmosphere was relaxed, and Sana, who answered the door, was cooperative, apologetic, and even friendly. The officers told Sana that she had to keep it down before then being on their way, and from this footage you can see how chill she and everybody else really was. And so, with that said, let's talk about the night of November the 12th, followed by the morning of November the 13th. It was a Saturday, meaning that football was the talk of the town. The University of Idaho Vandals played that afternoon, and with it being a home game at the Kibbe Dome, it drew in thousands of students. The Vandals would go on to win that evening, and so it is no surprise to learn that everyone in the area had a reason to celebrate. Sana and Ethan spent their evening at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, and friends would later confirm that the two were together for the entire night afterwards. It turns out that nothing about their evening stood out, and it's reported that the two left sometime sometime around 1:45, before then heading back towards the property on King Road. Meanwhile, both Kaylee and Madison spent their entire night downtown, staying together while they moved through their usual spots in the area. They eventually arrived at the Corner Club, which is a bar just off Main Street and, once again, a regular stop for them. Both surveillance footage and witness reports placed them here until around 1:30 that morning, where they appeared relaxed and with nothing out of the ordinary happening. There was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong or amiss either, so just like the other two, there was no obvious sign of drama or issue. When the bar closed, Madison and Kaylee walked a short distance towards the Grub Truck, a late-night food stand that was parked downtown. Just out of coincidence, it turns out that the truck was actually live streaming on Twitch at the time. The camera had surveillance over the sidewalk in a wide, grainy view, where both Madison and Kaylee can eventually be seen appearing on camera while waiting for their food. As you can see, they occasionally glance over towards the street, and then, at approximately 1:56 AM, the two then leave in a taxi, which was heading back toward King Road. Madison and Kaylee arrive home just before 2 AM, and coincidentally, both Sana and Ethan also make it back around the same time. And soon enough, all of the lights were out, and the property fell silent at last. Now, for a while, nothing happened, and all was peaceful. However, as we know, around 4 AM all of that changed. It all began when Dylan, who was asleep on the second floor, woke up to what sounded like the dog playing upstairs. You see, Murphy the dog belonged to Kaylee, and of course Kaylee was visiting Madison over the weekend, and all three of them lived above Dylan on the third floor. And with this being a student house, noise even this late at night wasn't unusual. It wasn't long after this encounter that Dylan then heard Kaylee say something along the lines of, "There's someone here." And again, while that was an odd thing to hear, it didn't register as a danger or a warning at the time. Instead, it sounded casual and perhaps even dismissive. A short while later, she then heard even more noise, but this time, it was actually coming from the same second floor. She described the sound as crying coming from Sana's room, to which she then heard a male voice respond with, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." However, once again, Dylan felt more confused than worried, and there was no obvious sign of struggle or shouting going on. And so, after checking her front door for the second time, she then headed back to sleep. But after opening her door for the third time, well, what she saw would stop her cold, because that is when she came face to face with a man who was walking straight towards her. Slowly slinking down the hallway, the man was dressed all in black, wore a face mask, and had bushy eyebrows, a detail that would later matter. But rather than say or do anything to Dylan, he quite literally ignored her existence. Instead, he walked by her and towards the sliding glass door. I mean that quite literally, by the way, because this man didn't even acknowledge Dylan. Instead, he just walked right by her and then, just like that, vanished into the night. Dylan stood frozen as the man passed by. Once he was gone, she then shut her door and locked herself inside her room. And it turns out that she was not the only person or thing to spot something strange that night either. At approximately 4:17 that morning, a security camera, which was found less than 50 feet away from the property, captured some rather strange audio. In this footage, you can hear what sounds like voices or a whimper, which was then followed by a loud thud, and then a dog barking repeatedly. It was around the same time that a white Hyundai Elantra was captured making several passes through the neighborhood, after which the car was seen leaving the area quite rapidly. Moving on to the crime scene. In the hours after the brutal discovery, investigators searched for clues high and low. Detectives concluded that the killer had actually done a very good job in leaving almost nothing behind. But, of course, in this day and age, there is always something that they can work on. It was on the third floor, and where Madison and Kaylee were found, that investigators discovered a tan leather knife sheath on the bed. The sheath was stamped with the markings Kabar USMC, and judging by its design, the sheath was designed to stay attached to a belt and not left behind at a crime scene. With all of this in mind, the sheath was carefully collected and then sent for forensic testing, and when the results came back, it was resounding. Located on the metal snap of this sheath was a single male DNA profile. The profile wasn't a mixture or degraded in the slightest. Instead, it offered one single suspect. As the lab work continued, investigators profiled the neighborhood and asked both far and wide for surveillance footage, and thankfully, what they found was movement. Through all of the hours of footage they scoured, no surprise, but they would eventually be most interested in the white Hyundai Elantra that we've already mentioned before. Now, initially, analysts believed the car to be a 2011 to 2013 model. However, this was eventually extended to be as new as 2016. When police asked the community for help in identifying the vehicle, their response was overwhelming. We're talking about thousands of tips pouring in, with many leads extending into Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and even Montana. That was a lot of land for police to cover. But I'd like to draw your attention to here, to the nearby town of Pullman, Washington, which can be found about 10 miles away from Moscow. Despite being in different states, driving between these two towns only takes around 15 minutes. And it turns out that one particular white Hyundai Elantra that came from the town of Pullman had now come across their sights. The vehicle's records would lead them to a graduate student living in the area, and his name was Bryan Kohberger. And surprisingly, not only did his vehicle fit the bill, but when detectives took a closer look into his profile, they realized that his trail was not actually subtle at all. In fact, he already had history with Moscow. It was in August of 2022, and only a few weeks before the killings, that Bryan had been stopped by Moscow police for a routine traffic violation. Now, at the time, this interaction was quite unremarkable. He gave the police officers his ID, answered their questions, and then provided them with his phone number. So, when investigators later applied for warrants to obtain historical phone records, they took this opportunity to check out his location data. And when they did, well, let's just say that it painted a pretty devastating story. Surprisingly, it showed that Bryan was in the area of King Road at least a dozen times in the months leading up to November the 13th, with most of these visits happening late at night or in the early hours of the morning. Of course, this was a very strange detail for detectives to realize because Bryan had no business in the area. So, why was he repeatedly traveling to King Road without any purpose or reason? Detectives also realized that between 3 and 5 on the morning of the murders, Bryan's phone stopped connecting to nearby towers altogether. It didn't appear near King Road or anywhere else for that matter, and was untraceable in a 4G and 5G rich area. In short, the phone was decisively turned off for 2 hours that morning, over the space where 4 people were murdered. And of course, that wasn't reassuring at all to detectives. If anything, it was incredibly suspicious. And when his phone was finally switched on and connected back to the network, it showed Bryan traveling southwest away from the crime scene, which of course aligned perfectly with the surveillance footage. And all of a sudden, the data, and even the lack of data, was creating a very damning picture. Now, if that wasn't enough already, detectives in Pennsylvania would then go on to recover trash from Bryan's family home. Of course, the main aim here was to try to find DNA that belonged to Bryan or his family. And when they finally tested trash that belonged to his father, lab analysis showed that the profile was consistent with being the biological father of the person whose DNA had been found on the knife sheath. All of a sudden, all of these separate articles of evidence which had once floated separately, that being the sheath, the car, the DNA, and the phone, was now all coming together. And what initially began as a lone, mysterious man walking down a hallway had now transpired into the actual name of the Idaho 4 killer. So, we know his name and we know all about his behavior, but who precisely is Bryan Kohberger? 27 years old at the time, Bryan Christopher Kohberger seemed ordinary enough at first. Of course, minus that death stare, because that is not ordinary. Now, on the surface, his life appeared to be structured and was directed by his routines, academic goals, and a quiet sense of ambition. Born on November the 21st, 1994, and raised in Pennsylvania, Bryan grew up in a suburban home with his parents and sisters. Family members would later describe his childhood as normal and definitely not troubled. He attended local schools, moved through his teenage years without any notable drama, and always seemed relaxed. People who knew Bryan in his earlier life do recall his struggles, however. As a teenager, Bryan dealt with both weight issues and social isolation. Over time, he would eventually lose most of his excess weight and would then become focused on discipline, boxing, running, and strict routines. Academically speaking, Bryan first earned himself an associate degree before then going on to receiving a bachelor's degree in psychology. Strangely enough, his interests would even narrow down towards crime, and he then went on to complete a master's degree in, you guessed it, criminal justice. Now, here's the interesting part, but it turns out that his coursework focused on criminal behavior, investigative methods, and even the mechanics of crime itself. And then, in 2022, he enrolled in a PhD program in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman. Bryan came across as both serious and reserved, and although he wasn't known as an extrovert, he was described as sometimes confident. Other people would say that he was cold, corrected others during discussions, and would take debate way too seriously. Oh, and another interesting side note, but he had also applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department as a data analyst. And although he wasn't accepted into the program, you can quite clearly see his intentions. In the days and weeks after the murders, and while Bryan was still a free man, people who saw him say he appeared quiet and more withdrawn. It was also noted that he attended all classes as usual, continued on with his routine, and although a little bit more quiet, his behavior didn't seem much different than before. It was almost like nothing big had happened in his life. But little did he know that soon enough he was going to come face to face with dozens of armed officers. It was on the morning of December the 15th, 2022, that Bryan and his father were driving home for the holidays. This included a 2,300-mile journey from Idaho to Pennsylvania. However, not long into the journey, officers would stop them in their tracks. But not for the reason you'd expect. They were initially stopped in Hancock County, where an officer pulled the vehicle over for following another one too closely. After approaching Bryan's window, he handed over his license and his registration without any hesitation. The deputy explained the reason for the stop, issued them a warning, and then sent Bryan and his father away. However, only 9 minutes later, officers appeared yet again. Now, at this stage, you might be thinking to yourself that maybe officers were finally going to arrest him. However, unfortunately, you'd be wrong. This time, it was an Indiana State Police trooper that stopped them for the very same reason as before. But even still, no search was conducted, and once again, they were released without a warning. Now, at the time, neither of these stops was unusual or strange, and no laws had been broken. So there was no plausible reason for them to detain Bryan. But of course, these two moments stand out not for what happened, but what didn't happen. You have to remember here that at this stage in the investigation, both Bryan and his car were under the spotlight, and yet here they were being noted down not once but twice before then being allowed to go on their way. However, thankfully, less than 2 weeks later, their journey would end in a very different way. By the final week of December, the investigation had gone quiet on the surface. However, behind the scenes, investigators were no longer looking for who was responsible, but instead were merely waiting to act on it. They already had the outline of the case, the car, the phone data, the timeline, the DNA, and the man responsible. And so, in the early hours of December the 30th, 2022, law enforcement finally made their move. It was shortly before dawn that a tactical team arrived at Bryan's family home. Now, according to police reports, they actually found him while he was digging through his own family's trash can while wearing latex gloves. Now, for any innocent person out there, I don't think that's how you'd spend your typical Friday morning. So, I guess you could say that they actually caught him red-handed. Bryan was arrested without incident, and when he arrived at the police station, he was charged as a fugitive from justice. That being a procedural step that allowed Idaho authorities to bring him back across state lines. Simultaneously, search warrants were executed on his home, his belongings, and the white Hyundai Elantra that had already travelled thousands of miles with him. Detectives would also seize both his phone and his computer, which, funnily enough, would conveniently lead to an entire album of his selfies being released, categorized into selfies that he had taken before the murders and after. Speaking of selfies, this one was taken not even 6 hours after he had murdered 4 innocent people. I would also like to question why he took so many photos of his own butt. Investigators would later state that sections of his browsing history from the weeks leading up to the murders were also missing, and that absence was extremely abnormal. And as for his mobile phone, well, unfortunately, data was sparse. Bryan barely kept any contacts in his phone book. It was mostly just his mother and father, and records showed that they frequently communicated in the days after the murders, which included both text messaging and phone calls. But beyond that, the authorities have been quite careful in what they have publicly released. They have referenced material suggesting rather disturbing interests, and have also noted that there are patterns of online activity that point towards fixation and control. However, most of that evidence has not been disclosed publicly in detail. But what really mattered here is that each element on its own would describe a little bit of the story. But when they were all put together, well, that created a much stronger picture, and one that was far more believable. The public's outrage was immediate, and as for Bryan's reputation, well, you could say that he's become one of the most hated men in America. In fact, he's become so notorious in the recent 2 or 3 years that I'd be surprised if he hadn't heard of his name before clicking this video. His trial was scheduled for June the 30th, 2025. And for about 2 years, everything was building up towards that moment. During all that time, they'd been collecting statements, testimonies, and of course all of the evidence that we've already talked about. But the thing is, that trial would unfortunately never happen, because only a few weeks before it was set to begin, Bryan accepted a plea agreement. To elaborate here, Bryan formally pleaded guilty to the murders of Madison, Kaylee, Sana, and Ethan, and an associated burglary charge. And with his plea accepted, he narrowly avoided any trial whatsoever. However, one of the most frustrating things about this case is that Bryan refused to comment past his plea deal. What that means is that he didn't provide any explanation or acknowledgement beyond the admission itself, and neither could the court ask him to describe what he had done or even why. It also meant that because he had pleaded guilty, the state was forced to withdraw its pursuit of the death penalty. It basically meant that because Bryan had merely said he was guilty, he wouldn't face trial, wouldn't have to explain himself, wouldn't have to face his victims' families, and wouldn't have to face death itself. But the good news here is that he also waived his right to any future appeals, and the legal system accepted certainty without any further detail, meaning there is literally no way he can leave prison. However, on the other side of the coin, it still means that we will never know his motive or any intricate details of his crime, because unfortunately, his right for trial in the future was waived away too. At his sentencing, the judge imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that each victim's life was recognized individually and that there would be no mechanism by which Bryan could ever be released in the future. He was also given additional time for the burglary charge too, which of course was largely symbolic in the face of his life sentences. During his hearing, family and loved ones of the victims addressed the courtroom. They spoke of who the Idaho 4 were before November the 13th, and how now their futures will never unfold due to the actions of one disturbed individual. Unsurprisingly, Bryan himself offered no statement of his own and basically kept quiet for the entire thing. And when the hearing was over, he was led away in handcuffs to begin the rest of his life in maximum security. And thankfully, from this moment onwards, his movements will be heavily controlled, his contact limited, and his days will be extremely repetitive. His life won't be easy, that's for sure. Not that it deserves to be, or, quite frankly, that he even deserves one. As you can likely imagine, his plea agreement did nothing to bring relief. In fact, for some people, it actually kind of felt unfinished. By removing the death penalty and requiring no explanation, his agreement left dozens of questions unanswered. Of course, as a result, the full story would never be told in court. And I'm still left wondering here, why that house? Why did he target those students? And what truly happened in those final minutes? Tragically, we will never know. Okay, as far as the factual information goes, this is where the story ends. But before I finish today, I would love to talk about the credible speculation that we've seen. As far as motive or direction is concerned, many people believe that Bryan may have been targeting Madison, whose bedroom was located on the 3rd floor. I would like to highlight that there is no proof that the two had any personal relationship or even knew each other. However, Bryan's movements do assume that maybe he was targeting her. The reason that some people believe this is that when intruding the property, he bypassed most of the rooms in the house and went straight to her bedroom. It is also the same room where Bryan's knife sheath was found. But the problem for Bryan is that, unexpectedly, Madison's friend Kaylee was also there at the time, which of course would have shifted his actions entirely. Mobile phone data would also suggest that Sana, who was on the 2nd floor, was also awake on her phone shortly before the murders, and that her room sat along the likely path that Bryan would have had to take to leave. This means that both Sana and Ethan would have likely been unintentional witnesses that Bryan would have likely wanted to silence after murdering both Madison and Kaylee. And with the speed in which Bryan left the property and the sheath left behind, many believe that the situation got out of hand and then he panicked. And so, if we were to believe these speculations, we would assume that Bryan had broken into the property with the objective of targeting Madison, panicked when he realized that she wasn't alone, murdered 2 innocent women as a result, and then doubled that to 4 when he realized that he couldn't leave any witnesses behind. Speaking of speculation, there are many thoughts and feelings around the Mad Greek, which, of course, is the restaurant where both Madison and Sana worked. In the early stages of this investigation, there were some media reports that suggested that maybe Bryan had visited the restaurant in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. And of course, this opened the doorway to possibilities of how Bryan had maybe become aware of Madison, or even Sana. The restaurant's owner has publicly denied recognizing Bryan and stated that neither she nor any of her staff ever recall him being there. In addition to this, law enforcement has never confirmed any interaction between him and the victims at the restaurant, and no evidence has ever been released to support the claim either. And so, as it stands, and as far as we know, the whole Mad Greek connection remains unverified. And all of that is despite this image right here, which is an image released by law enforcement showing a raw data extract taken from a Google review. Anyway, that is as much as I would like to speculate, and I'm going to wrap this one up by remembering who the Idaho 4 were, because their lives matter far more than the person who took them. Madison Mogen was more than just a name tied to a case. She was a friend who showed up, a co-worker who made work easy, and a daughter who stayed close to home even when she was planning her future. Family and friends alike miss her tremendously, and the void that she has left behind will likely never heal. This is the same for Kaylee Gonzalez, who was a true friend with an honest path ahead. She had plans already forming, a new job waiting, and a life that was only beginning to open outwards. She loved fiercely, spoke openly, and returned to Moscow that weekend for only one simple reason: to lovingly spend time with one of her friends who had become an important part of her life. Sana Kanodal was known for her energy and her humor, and her friends remember her for the way that she filled a room without even trying. She balanced work, school, and relationships responsibly, and still made time and space for happiness. Ethan was described as kind beyond measure and made people feel included without effort. On the night that he was murdered, he was staying with the person that he loved, in a house that he felt safe in, and in a town that always was. As for the house on King Road, it remained vacant for a long time, but over the weeks and then months and then years that it remained empty, it basically became an ominous ghost in the area, reminding people and the town of the horrors that that it held. And so, it is no surprise to learn that, eventually, it was decided to be torn down as a matter of respect. Now, only open ground remains in its space, and it's not clear if anything will ever be built on top again. In the same way that we finished last week's video, I always find it fascinating when a building is left behind, not only for what it stood for before the murders, but also how it transformed in the process. I think in this case, it absolutely was the right decision to demolish the house, because, unfortunately, those four walls have experienced so much pain. And that, folks, is the case of the Idaho 4, at least as it currently stands in January of 2026. Of course, with Bryan not sharing much of his own motive or story, there is still potential for more information to come out in the future. We can only hope that he does so to bring closure to the victims' families. Before I go, I'd love to know what you think about this case, because, of course, it is quite the notorious one, so I'm sure you have your own opinion. As always, please share your thoughts in the comments section down below. I really do appreciate the feedback too. And thank you again to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. Go to ZocDoc.com/coffeehousecrime to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can go to my Instagram, Facebook, or Spotify, all under the name of Coffeehouse Crime. But of course, YouTube is my main home base. Anyway, folks, as you can probably tell, my voice is absolutely shot today, so I'm gonna end it here. I'll see you again very shortly for another video, likely next week. But until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves and each other. And of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.